Can we please put out the lights? Out the lights and on the glasses. By training, as David just said, I'm a Greek and Roman archaeologist. So if tonight I venture to talk about Michelangelo's David, this requires an apology, or at least some kind of explanation. And here it is. Some years ago in Berlin, a group of students organized a seminar on the role of classical antiquity in Florence between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and they invited me kindly to participate. The seminar was followed by a trip to Florence, during which we also spent an afternoon in the Galleria dell'Accademia. Standing in front of the David, I asked a question that would come natural to anybody used to deal with ancient Greek sculpture. What is this young man doing? The question generated a lively conversation, but there was no convincing output. So back in Berlin, I began to consult the literature on the David, and I was puzzled. The action depicted had never been considered a problem. Little attention had been paid also to the object in David's hands. Everyone merely noted that it was a sling. But how does David hold this sling? Let me show you just two normal depictions. I could show 200 of them. One on the left is a silver plate from the 7th century here in the Metropolitan, and on the right, a marble inlay from the floor of the dome in Siena, early 15th century. Both slingers have the sling in their right hand, holding it by two hands, as one does. Michelangelo's David holds the sling with two hands, hiding it behind his back, an attitude for which there is no parallel in the whole of slinger iconography. Leonardo must have considered this attitude awkward too. He depicted Michelangelo's David in a charcoal drawing, adding, with one stroke of his pen, a sling in David's right hand, in order to make it look normal. But why did Michelangelo choose such an anomalous attitude in the first place? What does it mean for the action depicted? And what follows for the interpretation of the statue as a whole? So I started investigating a bit. The management of the Galleria dell'Accademia kindly granted me access to the scaffold that is periodically erected to clean the statue once a month. From up there, and it's a light, rather shaky stand, from up there I had a closer look at the sling. And today I think I understand what David is doing. But before I come to that, I would like to give a very brief summary of what the discipline of art history has found out concerning the production of the statue. In 1501, Michelangelo, he was then 26 years old, decided to return to Florence, the city he had left in 1494. What made him come back was the commission for a colossal marble statue. 2.5 years later, the statue was finished. The David, 434 centimeters tall, is usually regarded as the first colossal statue of the modern era, carved from a single block and erected outside of any architectural context. But neither the colossal format nor the place where the statue was finally placed was a result of Michelangelo's solitary choice. The placement next to the entrance of the Palazzo della Signoria was decided where you see it still standing there. That's a cast, it's not the original. But that's where it stood and where it still stands today. The placement next to the entrance of the Palazzo della Signoria was decided at the last moment. Originally, the statue had been planned as the crowning of one of the buttresses on the side domes of the Duomo. And you see it tiny. I mean, that's of course a reproduction that was placed there for 2 days in the 90s of the 20th century. The plan to crown these buttresses with statues dates back to the early 15th century, so much earlier than the David. In order to be visible from below, these statues had to be of colossal format. The first were made of terracotta in several pieces to be put together and painted white to fit the marble context. Then, in the 1460s, a statue of David to be sculpted in marble, for the first time, not anymore in plaster, but in marble, was commissioned to Agostino di Duccio. And for this purpose, a colossal block, 18 feet high, was brought from Carrara. A bit later, the commission to Agostino was cancelled, we don't know why, and the marble block remained unused. He had sketched out the figure, but not accomplished it. And this is the block that in 1501 was entrusted to Michelangelo. The contract mentioned explicitly that the block had been sketched out in a bad way, male abbozzatum, as it says in the contract. The contract is an odd mixture of Latin and Italian. In what way Michelangelo managed to remedy this, we do not know. By January 1504, the statue was finished, but meanwhile, the opinion about the destination had changed. The city government was in favor of placing it near the town hall in Piazza della Signoria. The reasons for this reconsideration may have been purely logistical. After all, lifting a statue of some 6,000 kilos to the top of a buttress, a dozen meters high, and then fixing it there would have been no small task. However, the plan could also have been related to the subject of the statue. For some time, the municipal government had shown a proclivity to commission or purchase statues of David for display in the Palazzo della Signoria. As early as 1416, the Sala dei Gigli, which served as a waiting room for audiences, had been decorated with a marble David by Donatello, you see in here. An inscription on the base of the statue, the inscription is lost, declared that God would help anybody who fearlessly fought for his country, even against the most terrible foe. 2 generations later, in the 1470s, the government purchased a second statue of David. It was a bronze figure, a little smaller than natural, by Verrocchio, and it was placed in front of the entrance to the Sala dei Gigli. To these was added, 20 years later, a third David, again by Donatello, but this time in bronze. The statue had been made around 1450 for Cosimo Medici. In 1494, the Medici had to flee the city. The new Republican government had this David transferred from the Palazzo Medici to the town hall, the Palazzo della Signoria, where it was placed in the courtyard. The Signoria's insistence on acquiring statues of David shows that the young victor of Goliath had become the symbol of the municipality's fitness to fight. And given these precedents, it is not very surprising that after Michelangelo had completed his David, a committee of the best-known artists in Florence was convened in order to reconsider the statue's destination. The committee finally resolved to place the new David on the so-called Aringhiera, a tribune that ran along the western facade of the Palazzo della Signoria. You see the Aringhiera on the right. This is a fresco from the late 15th century. And there, it's too early for the David to be there, but on this Aringhiera, on the left of the entrance, of the main entrance to the Palazzo, the statue remained until 1873, when it was moved to the Galleria dell'Accademia and a plaster cast remained, stone cast artificial stone cast remained where it is. The two statues by Donatello and by Verrocchio, and you see them now in chronological order, they form obviously a series. All three represent the young hero after his victory. He stands over Goliath's severed head, his left hand resting casually on his hip. Michelangelo must have been very well acquainted with these three statues, and all the more significant are the changes he introduced. Both Donatello and Verrocchio had emphasized the figure's boyishness. In Michelangelo's David, the signs of age are more equivocal, perhaps even contradictory. The figure has disproportionately large hands and a large head, as might happen to a boy who has not yet completed the process of its growth. On the other hand, the athletic build of the body, as well as the pubis, suggest greater maturity. But the substantial difference vis-à-vis the tradition of the elder three statues is another. Michelangelo has eliminated Goliath's severed head. The victory has not yet been achieved. What we see is David before the fight. For such a depiction, there was in Florence a famous precedent. The statue of St. George by Donatello in one of the external niches of San Michele, executed between 1415 and 1417. Vasari praises in St. George his, I quote, look of vivacity fierce and terrible, and a marvelous gesture of moving within that stone. Ed un maraviglioso gesto di muoversi dentro a quel sasso. George's left shoulder is drawn forward, and his head is turned slightly to the side. The steadfast gaze from beneath the knotted brows is directed towards where we should imagine the dragon. It is clear that Donatello is showing us the saint before the fight. Michelangelo has taken up Donatello's dynamism and amplified it. David's right leg is bearing all the weight, while the left leg is relaxed and slightly flexed. The whole composition obeys the rule of chiasmus, as they had been canonical in ancient Greek sculpture. The left hip lowers over the non-supporting leg. The resulting inclination of the hip is compensated for by the contraction and extension of the upper body, so that the left shoulder is higher than the right one. It is difficult to find any parallels for this kind of ponderations in 15th century. Michelangelo seems to have drawn on models for antiquity, or he might have invented the contrapposto all by himself another time. Compared with the George statue, Michelangelo has also amplified the energetic turn of the head and the contraction of the eyebrows. The direction of David's gaze tells us where we should imagine Goliath standing. And we also have to imagine Goliath's size. The statue of David is at least twice as big as natural. Not for nothing, the contemporary sources commonly refer to it simply as Il Gigante, the giant. Yet this giant asks us to imagine another unseen giant, still much larger. And this is a very skillful way to play with size. David has no attribute except for the strap that stretches from the left shoulder across the back down to the right hand. Some information about this strap is provided by Michelangelo himself. Among the rare drawings, very rare drawings, whose attribution to Michelangelo is not controversial, is this one in the Louvre. At the center of the drawing, we see the sketch of a right arm, including the shoulder, and this is evidently David's right arm. The hand is smaller than on the finished statue, and Michelangelo has tried out different finger positions. This must be a preparatory sketch. Next to the arm, we see upside down the sketch of another figure, smaller in size. It refers to a bronze statue of David commissioned from Michelangelo in 1502. It was completed and delivered, but has been lost. On the other side of the arm sketch are 3 lines in carefully formed calligraphy, and they also refer to David. Davide con la fromba e io con l'arco, Michelangelo. Fromba or frombola is the Italian term for this type of sling. David with the fromba, the meaning is clear. But what does io con l'arco, I with the bow, what does this mean? The association of the bow with the sling might suggest that both are to be understood as weapons. But in what sense could Michelangelo attribute to himself the use of bow and arrows? A more plausible suggestion has been made by Marcel Briand in 1942 and Charles Seymour in 1967, independently from each other. Both relate arco to the bow with which the sculptor operates his drill. And now we understand the connection between Michelangelo draws between David and himself. This is a reconstruction of a bow drill, and underneath you have a bow drill of the early 19th century. Today they use electrical drills, of course. And Michelangelo has been using a drill on the David quite clearly. You see drill holes up here, and the drill holes are of different size. Some are larger, some are very small, and you see them only from very close distance, of course. You're supposed not to see them from below. Now we understand why Michelangelo is drawing a connection between David and himself. Both have a gigantic opponent to conquer. David is faced with Goliath, and Michelangelo with an enormous block of marble. Both tasks are perceived as agonal challenges. David and Michelangelo can rely on their skill and complete mastery of a certain tool. David on his sling, fromba, Michelangelo on his drill, and of course on hammer and chisel, but these would not have allowed for a pun with the sling. Let us come now to the statue and to the sling. The part of the sling that David is holding in his left hand looks thicker than the rest. Are we to understand that David is holding the sling's pouch, the part that serves as a pocket for the projectile? This is the general opinion of everybody that has dealt with the sling, not very many people. And this is also what I initially thought. Now I think I was wrong. And let's see why. If the left hand was holding the pocket that is placed in the middle of the sling, must be placed in the middle of the sling, then the right hand would have to hold both ends of the sling, and on the back of the statue we should be able to make out 2 straps. Let us take a closer look. The strap running across the back has a texture that appears somewhat rougher than the epidermis of the statue, and its width varies slightly. This suggests rather leather than some sort of textile. At one point, just to the left of the spine, the strap has a vertical fold along its left edge. It seems that this is thin, very soft leather. In any case, what we see here is quite clearly 1 strap lying closely against the figure's back, not 2 straps. There is no trace of a second strap. From this follows that David must be holding one end of the sling in his left and the other in his right hand. And let us now look at the 2 ends. One end is inside David's right hand, you see it here, and it looks like a little roll fitting the palm of the hand. More complicated is the opposite hand. It was severely damaged along with the left hand and forearm. In 1527, the statue was hit by a bench thrown out of a window of the palace. The fragments were collected and reassembled with the help of an iron grappa. However, you see the fragments on the right. However, there are no later additions. What we see today corresponds, despite the damage, to what Michelangelo sculpted, so we can trust what we see. What we see is this: the strap, after resting loosely on the shoulder, splits into an upper and a lower part, forming a loop that David is gently holding with his left hand. The opening of the loop is clearly shown on the outer side, even though it is partly covered by the thumb. On the inner side, the place where the strap splits is obscured by the index finger. Here, the opening of the loop takes the form of a narrow slit. What matters in our context, however, is the clear difference between the two ends of the strap. One exhibits the form of a small roll, fitting well into the hand. The other has the form of a flexible open loop. And in order to understand this difference, we need to envisage how a sling functions. For this purpose, it is useful to consult today's slingers. They are particularly numerous here in the US. Not in New York, you have to go a little bit further west. Mine, which you see here, comes from Berryville in Arkansas. It consists of synthetic fibers twisted to form a rope, usually used for parachutes. In the middle is the pouch for the projectile. To operate the sling, you insert the projectile into the pouch, then you take the two ends of the cord with your right hand and you swing the projectile, making it rotate, the acceleration being increased by centrifugal force. There we go. The movement of the arm is similar to the one by which one would deliver a strike with a whip. The sling functions as a lever, increasing the acceleration effect. At the very end, the arm points towards the goal. You release the projectile by letting go one of the ends of the sling. The stone flies toward the target at a speed of up to more than 100 kilometers an hour. It is, of course, decisive to let go only one end of the sling, and this is exactly why the two ends are designed so differently. One end must be easy to hold and therefore also easy to let go. For this purpose, the rope is thickened, often, as in my case, simply with a knot. As for the other hand, it needs to be securely attached, preventing it from slipping out of the hand when the first end is released, and therefore it has a loop by which it can be fixed to the finger. The oldest sling projectiles we know are archaeological findings from Mesopotamia, clay balls dating back to the 8th or 7th millennium. The earliest literary reference to a sling is found in cuneiform inscriptions around 2000 BCE. We are therefore dealing with a very ancient weapon, one that through migration or contact has spread throughout the world. There is evidence of the use of the sling all around the Mediterranean, in Africa, on the Indian subcontinent, on the coast of East Asia from Indonesia to Mongolia, on some islands in the Pacific, as well as in North and South America, from Alaska to Terra del Fuego. Only in Australia, the sling appears to be missing. In the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean, the sling has had considerable military importance, and this importance declined during the Middle Ages. Troops now were often recruited from urban population that lacked military practice and had to be trained from scratch, which favored the choice of a weapon like the crossbow that required much less training. You can learn easily how to use a crossbow. It takes much longer to learn how to use a sling. The sling nevertheless remained in usage in the countryside for hunting. The so-called Bayeux tapestry, produced in the late 11th century, consists of a main frieze dedicated to aristocratic deeds culminating in the Battle of Hastings, 1066, and a lower frieze decorated with a more humble iconography. And here we find a sequence of scenes with peasants plowing, harrowing, and sawing. A fourth peasant on the right is shown with a sling chasing away birds. And these are obviously all habitual activities. This is not one historical episode, this is what one does. Particularly clear is the depiction of a sling in an English manuscript of the first 6 books of the Bible, dating from the second quarter of the 11th century. The image refers to Abraham, who has prepared the sacrifice for the Lord. The sacrificial animals are a goat, a ram, a cow, and 2 pigeons. They attract 3 predatory birds that Abraham must drive away. How Abraham achieves this, the Bible does not say. The illustration has provided him with a sling as the weapon that seemed more plausible for this purpose, fixed to a finger, as you see, by a little loop. The other hand is provided with a knot. The next slide brings us close to Michelangelo, both in topographical and in chronological terms. It's a drawing by Leonardo, preserved in the Codex Atlanticus dating to the 1580s. On this sheet, Leonardo, on the 1480s, sorry. On this sheet, Leonardo drew several, I quote, ways of hurling things far away, modi di trarre lontano, as the title at the top says. 2 details depict a right hand with a sling, frommola, attached to the index finger of the hand by the usual loop. So you see that the shape and the use of the sling is constant over a very long period of time. This might suffice for a better understanding of the weapon in the hands of Michelangelo's David. David holds in his right hand what slingers today call the release end, which is thickened by rolling it up. This roll is just the functional equivalent of the knot in the slings we have just seen. David's left hand holds the loop of the retention end. The whole sling is evidently conceived as being made of leather. This is unusual because slings are usually made out of braided fibers, and this is true for the slings we encounter around the world as for those we find depicted. If leather is used at all, then just for the central pocket. It seems unlikely that Michelangelo ever saw a sling made entirely out of leather. Far more plausible is that he used the common braided sling as a model and translated its form into an object made of leather. Possibly he wanted to depict a particularly primitive form of sling, predating the invention of string braiding. This derivation from a braided sling would also explain such a detail as the splitting of the strap in 2 between the left shoulder and the hand without any visible seam or any other kind of juncture. The shape looks puzzling as long as we think of it being executed in leather. It becomes perfectly plausible if we translate it back into a cord that is divided into 2 braids and ends in a loop. Michelangelo took advantage of the broad leather strap to create a surprising effect. The most conspicuous element of a normal sling is the pocket for the stone placed at the center, at equal distance between the 2 ends. We would expect to find it on David's back, but there is no sign of it. Michelangelo has depicted a sling without central pocket. A sling without a pocket is risky to handle. Without the hold of a pouch, the projectile could slip out during the launch. Or, to be more precise, there would be such a risk if the sling were operated by somebody with less skill. David seems to have mastered the technique of the sling so perfectly that he can dispense with the help of a pocket. To conclude, Michelangelo shows a very particular sling. On the one hand, it is characterized by an almost primitive simplicity, while on the other, it requires particular skill. We also have to remark the lack of a projectile. Some scholars have suggested that a stone might be hidden in the right hand, but this hand contains nothing but the rolled end of the sling. There is no trace of a stone. Nevertheless, the absence of ammunition does not seem to make David nervous. An appropriate stone will be easy to find, and David is not going to need more than one. Michelangelo has not only dispensed with the bag and the stone, he has made the sling virtually invisible by hiding it behind David's back. In the front view of the statue, the strap of the sling is barely visible and hard to identify as such. Visible is only the end of the sling that passes over the shoulder and ends in David's left hand. If we compare David's sling with mine from Berryville, we see that Michelangelo has enlarged the loop to make it more visible. At the same time, he has partially hidden it behind the fingers of the left hand. By this paradoxical procedure, Michelangelo challenges the viewer's attention, placing the viewer in a situation very similar to Goliath. Goliath, too, can see so little of the sling that he's unable to identify it as a weapon, and precisely in this consists David's stratagem. We have already said that David's gaze shows us the direction in which we are to imagine Goliath. But perhaps we can also say something about the distance involved. Goliath is not yet so close as to harm David, otherwise the latter would not be so calm. David's weight is all on his right leg. His left foot points in the direction of his opponent, but without the slightest hint yet of taking a step. Obviously, it is Goliath who is actively approaching. We imagine him as enormous and fully armed, probably bellowing threats and insults. However, and this is important, Goliath's superiority requires, to be effective, a combat hand-to-hand. With all his strength, a warrior like Goliath would never risk coming near an enemy identifiable as a slinger. It would mean to expose himself to mortal danger. And this is why David must necessarily hide his sling. By holding it behind his back, he lures his opponent into a deadly trap, using his naked, seemingly helpless young body as a bait. David knows his sling and its range. He knows how close he must let his opponent come. All he has to do is to wait. For a sculpture, such a waiting is an unprecedented theme. The suspense arises less from the depicted action than from the gradual approach of Goliath, whom the beholder does not see but is called to imagine. The beholder must observe the statue carefully in order to understand what David is doing, and thus to foresee what the dull giant, on the other hand, does neither see nor understand. The originality of Michelangelo's David is made even more evident by the comparison with two depictions of David that have been produced about 1 century later. The first one, you see it here, is a painting by Orazio Gentileschi dated 1607. We see Goliath's body from head to toe in a foreshortening of great virtuosity. The stone thrown by David has struck Goliath in the middle of the forehead, but only stunned him. There Goliath lies on his back, the eyes closed. In the fall, his breastplate has shifted to the side. It covers now the right shoulder, trapping the right arm. And this is why the giant raises his left arm in a vague gesture of defense against a danger he cannot see, but which is about to prove deadly. Above the giant looms David holding Goliath's sword, about to vibrate the final blow. In the very foreground, to the left, lies on the ground the sling, rendered with didactic precision. We see the loosely woven projectile holder in the middle and the two hands, one of them thickened by a knot, the other equipped with a loop. This is the form of the sling we have by now become familiar with. But was Gentileschi also familiar with it? He does not seem to regard the sling as an object of everyday use. Rather, he treats it as a rare, ancient find to be displayed in the foreground, commending it to the viewer's attention. The painter took the trouble to understand exactly how this sling is made and how it works, perhaps precisely because it was no longer an object he was familiar with. It required special attention in order to be appropriately depicted. The second example is one of the great masterpieces of Baroque sculpture. Gian Lorenzo Bernini sculpted his David for the private collection of Cardinal Scipione Borghese in 1623. The contrast with Michelangelo's statue is obvious and, of course, intended. We see David in full action in a lunging position. His right leg is advanced, the torso tilts to the right, while the head turns violently to the left, the face contracted in an expression of wild energy. The attitude of the body closely follows the model of an ancient statue that Cardinal Borghese had purchased 10 years earlier. Both statues, you see them here, share the same position, the same tilt of the torso, the same twisting of the head. The ancient statue depicts a warrior with a sword. The sword is lost in his right hand, and a shield equally lost, strapped to his left raised arm in a defensive stance. Bernini modified, as we can see, the movement of the left arm, which David tends downward. Both left and right arms of David are busy with the sling. The left hand holds the pocket with the stone, while the right hand stretches the rope. This braided rope with its two strands bridging the wide space between one hand and the other is in itself an unprecedented feat of daring by the sculptor. There is, however, a fundamental difference between this and any other sling we have seen. You see again the sling in the painting by Gentileschi. In the case of Gentileschi's sling and of any normal sling, the right hand should hold the two ends of the rope, one of which would be released at the moment of the throw. Bernini's sling, on the contrary, does not have two ends. It consists of one continuous cord that proceeds from the pocket on the right and ends there again. One could use such a device to swirl a stone around, but not to throw it. There is no way to deliver the projectile. Bernini is neither familiar with the functioning of a sling, nor has he the least interest in the matter. What he put into David's hand is not a sling, it is a prop that only a superficial beholder will mistake for a sling. It is, of course, a gorgeous proof of sculptural virtuosity, but as a weapon, it makes no sense whatsoever. Bernini's lack of interest in the sling has wider implications for the statue as a whole. The gesture of David's right hand with one finger hooked into the cord in order to stretch it tight, this very gesture, if we understand it as part of a concrete and coherent action, turns out to be completely absurd. It simply makes no sense to stretch the cord. Nevertheless, from a formal perspective, the gesture is highly effective. It increases the level of tension. And this is highly characteristic for the intention Bernini pursues. His point of departure was the ancient statue, the attitude of which he adopted with minor changes. The model is supposed to remain identifiable, at least for the connoisseur. Beyond that, Bernini aims at a culmination of pathos and tension. Expressiveness is all. The question as to what David is actually doing, this question matters no more. Of great importance to Bernini, however, are certain details mentioned in the biblical narrative. The Bible says that David, before going to meet Goliath, stops to pick up 5 stones that he puts in his shepherd's bag, and Bernini places a bag over David's shoulder. The Bible says that King Saul offers David his breastplate, and Bernini places an elaborate armor between David's legs. David, says the Bible, is an accomplished harp player, and Bernini shows us a harp resting on the ground next to the armor. Cardinal Borghese, who commissioned the work, will surely have appreciated such biblical references. As an art connoisseur, he will also have relished the comparison between Bernini's David and the ancient statue that was part of his own collection. He will have equally appreciated in Bernini's statue the skillful twisting and the dynamic expressiveness. On the other hand, we can be fairly certain that Cardinal Borghese had never seen a sling, and much less ever handled one. And the same seems to apply to Bernini. The young sculptor, acclaimed for his virtuosity, works at a level where technical concreteness and proper use of a primitive tool like a sling has become perfectly negligible. Let me, in the end, return to Michelangelo. He has, on the one hand, concealed the sling that Gentileschi and Bernini beautifully put on display, the latter without caring in the least to understand what he was depicting. At the same time, however, Michelangelo's sling is a perfectly functional tool, even if reduced to the bare essentials, to a simple strip of leather. Michelangelo has depicted David in an attitude of relaxed waiting. And for this attitude of astounding nonchalance, the language of the Renaissance had a precise technical term. This was sprezzatura. Baldassar Castiglione, in his book of the courtier, Il Cortegiano, introduces the term explicitly as, I quote, a new word, una nuova parola. The text of the Cortegiano, which was drafted in 1513 and went to press in 1528, presents a series of fictional conversations by individuals bearing the names of historical contemporaries of the author. The setting is the court of Urbino in the year 1507. The book deals with the abilities of the ideal man of court, Il Cortegiano, the wide spectrum of which extends from skills in combat and hunting to elegance of manners and ease in conversation. A constant requirement are dexterity and strength, acquired by assiduous practice, but they must never give the impression of being the result of an effort. Whatever the gentleman does, he must do it with grace, grazia. Let me quote one of the interlocutors who has a very outspoken theory about this, and this is, of course, a very famous text. Having thought, the translation is by Charles Singleton, having thought many times already about how this grace is acquired, I have found quite a universal rule which in this matter seems to me valid above all others and in all human affairs, whether in word or in deed. And that is, to use a new word perhaps, to practice in all things a certain nonchalance, sprezzatura, so as to conceal all art and make whatever is done or said appear to be without effort and almost without any thought about it. And I believe much grace comes of this, because everyone knows the difficulty of things that are rare and well done. Wherefore, facility in such things causes the greatest wonder. Whereas, on the other hand, to labor and, as we say, to drag forth by the hair of the head shows an extreme want of grace and causes everything, no matter how great it may be, to be held in little account. Therefore, we may call that art true art, which does not seem to be art. Nor must one be more careful of anything than of concealing it, because if it is discovered, this robs a man of all credit and causes him to be held in slight esteem. Castiglione describes a social reality that is also the one in which Michelangelo operates. The similarity between what is required of the nobleman and the attitude of the David seems obvious. Even when faced with unusual and dangerous tasks, even when one's own life is at stake, and sometimes even more than that, one must conceal all effort, flaunt ease and naturalness. And it is precisely this ease that generates, as Castiglione puts it, the greatest wonder. David awaits a terrible opponent, but without making tension appear. His elegantly relaxed attitude makes him the perfect embodiment of sprezzatura. This concept, so apt to the subject of the statue, can be applied to the artist as well. I quote Castiglione again. Therefore, we may call that art true art, which does not seem to be art, però si può dir quella esser vera arte che non pare esser arte. As David overcame Goliath, so has Michelangelo overcome the gigantic marble block made a mess of by his predecessor. For decades, the stone had been considered no longer usable and left to lie where it was. Then came Michelangelo and created from it the marvel that is this gigantic figure, which stands there with such naturalness that we forget all previous failures and difficulties. Hiding his art, Michelangelo behaves like David hiding his weapon. He also displays the sprezzatura that Castiglione describes as one of the cardinal virtues of his time. Thank you very much for your attention.